Just to remind us, okay, Jesus' message, the gospel that he preached was very simple. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then he unpacked it for us in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Short, pithy sayings, appropriate in his culture, but they carried a tremendous amount of meaning hidden behind them. And we've been exploring that. So today that brings us to the fifth description of those who belong to the kingdom. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. That the first question that came to me was, what is mercy? And
we know what mercy is. It's Julius Caesar letting the foe that he's already vanquished live. And everybody admires him for being such a magnanimous general.
Okay, I beat you down, and then I am merciful to you. Yep. Okay. And boy, we like that kind of mercy, don't we? Well, as I was studying this, first of all, I learned that in the Greek and in the Hebrew, mercy and grace are two completely different things. And yet in English, and especially in Christianity, we seem to mix them together. Grace just simply meant, I like you. I like you. So in the Old Testament, we frequently hear, there are frequent passages that talk about Joseph found grace in the eyes of Pharaoh. It just meant that Pharaoh liked him. Okay. Didn't necessarily say what Pharaoh did for him. Today we call that favoritism. Joseph found grace in the eyes. He found favor in the eyes of Pharaoh. He was the teacher's pet. And that doesn't really resonate with mercy. So I went looking for mercy in the Old Testament, and I found some startling things. Turn with me to Job, chapter 6. The Bibles that we have in the pews, which is the New King James. And then I want to read it out of one of the modern translations, because of the connection that it creates there. Okay. So, Vivian, why don't you start us out? Just start with, go ahead and read 1 and 2.
Well, I'm not in the Pew Bible, but this is the King James. Oh,
you can share.
Job 6, 1 and 2.
And then we'll just read around the congregation in sequence.
Then Job answered and said, "Oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid with it on the scale. For then it would be heavier than the sands of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash." Did I do that right?
You're fine.
For the arrows of the Almighty are within me. My spirit drinks in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me.
Does a wild donkey bray when it has grass? Or does the ox low over its fodder? Can flavorless food be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg?
The things that my soul refused to touch are as my sorrowful meat. Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for.
Even that it pleased God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Then should I yet comfort ye, I would pardon myself in sorrow, let him not spare, for I have not concealed the word of the Holy One.
What strength do I have that I should hope? And what is my end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze?
Is my help not within me, and is success driven from me? To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty.
My brothers have dealt deceitfully like a brook, like the streams of brooks that pass away. Now, those last two verses were what struck me in this discussion.
To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers have dealt deceitfully like a brook, like the streams of the brooks that pass away.
Put this in the flow of the story of Job. Job lost everything except his wife, who was a thorn in the flesh. And he was sitting on the ash heap, scraping his open sores, when his friends finally came to comfort him. And their first response was, for 2 weeks they sat silent beside him. And finally, after 2 weeks, he broke the silence and expressed his despair. Said how he wished that God would just kill him, or that he had never been born. Anything would be better than what I have here. And they couldn't be with that. Their response was to judge. To judge his words. And I find that I am kind of like Job's friends.
Me?
When my friends are in trouble, I want to fix things. There are 2 priorities when somebody is in trouble. Number 1, you want to fix the problem. And number 2, you want to prevent it from happening again. So, I find in myself this tendency. My house is right next to yours, Amanda. Your house is on fire. I will get my hose out and make sure that my roof and my wall are wet so that the fire doesn't spread, and then I will turn my hose on your house. In a crowd, if someone yells, "Somebody stole my wallet!" what is the first reaction that people have? A man reaches for his pocket, and a woman reaches for her purse. They don't start searching for the stolen wallet and the stolen purse until they have verified that their wallet is still in place, their purse is still in place. And this is kind of human nature. I find this in myself, and I see it in the behaviors of others. When someone is in trouble, our first priority is to make sure it doesn't spread to us, or doesn't involve us. And then we reach out to try to fix the problem in the other person's. But I find that that is very difficult, because when I start trying to fix the problem in the other person's life, it usually means that I say, you know, you shouldn't have done this. You did this, and now you're suffering the consequences. So stop doing that. But if I can find something that they did wrong, if I find something that they did that brought this trouble upon them, should I then step in to relieve the suffering that they're under? Don't they need to learn from their mistakes? Isn't that what we say about kids? You just have to let them learn from their mistakes. And we criticize parents who always bail Johnny out. I'm like Job's friends. His friends called him to repent. If bad things happen to you, it most probably means that you did something bad. You need to look for grounds for repentance instead of protesting your innocence and pointing fingers at everybody else, the problems at home. What they're really saying, what we really are saying in those situations is, I don't have to worry about this coming home to me because I don't do those things. When Job refused to accept their counsel to repent, then they got testy. And they started criticizing him, telling him he was a hypocrite or had hardened his heart. Okay? So, as I was meditating on this and reading on this, I started trying to look for parallels in my life, and some current events came up. And you and I had a very intense conversation. I think your mother thought we were arguing. Okay? For
I was defending Job, he was the friends.
But I'd like you to share some. This was a discussion about current events, and I'd like Eric to share both some of the research that he did and some of the perspectives that he brought to that discussion.
So Dad told me that as he's been listening to people's reactions to what's been going on in Ferguson, ever since they announced that the police officer who killed an unarmed young black man was not indicted, so he won't stand trial to find out whether the killing was justified. So huge reactions all over the country to this and several other shootings. You've probably seen lots about it. Dad said that he's noticed two themes in the way that people respond to seeing this on the news. One is to say, when you look at riots that have attended some of the protests, what you're seeing is bad people that are just looking for an excuse to do bad things. We judge their behavior. The other pattern he recognized is that when we look at people who are protesting peacefully, many of us default to believing that what they're complaining about is ridiculous. That the police treat people of color just as fairly as they treat whites. And so that the thing that people feel that they are angry about is misplaced. And in that case, we judge their words. So we judge people's behaviors and their words. So, if we don't want to make the same mistake that Job's friends made in pointing to Job's behaviors and words as the problem, when Job was blameless, then this is where we start to ask, how are we to practice mercy? How do we not be like Job's friends? And to me, the first step to putting mercy into practice is, and this may sound paradoxical, is to do justice. But here by justice, I don't mean punishing people when they go wrong. I mean doing justice to other people's stories. Job's friends were not doing justice to Job's complaint, to the way Job saw himself.
In the sense that they weren't listening to him?
Yeah, I mean, their presence was admirable. 2 weeks sitting in solidarity with somebody who's suffering is, I have no criticism for that. But when they opened their mouth, they made clear that they did not understand Job's perspective.
So active listening to the point where we not only understand intellectually, but can identify with the impact that it has on their lives.
Right. And often we don't understand intellectually either. If you have no experience with what the black community perceives as their grievance over the last few decades, and if you have no experience with the injustice that they believe they still suffer today, even though we don't have segregation and so forth anymore, then you're not going to see clearly. You're going to think everybody's upset at this one cop and trying to lynch this one cop, when to them it's about much more than that.
Okay.
So I feel that trying to understand the root of people's suffering and where they're coming from by looking past the words and behaviors that rub us wrong. You know, when people are protesting in the streets, they have a little tiny sign with about 4 words on it that are usually very pithy and incendiary. But if the slogans bother you, then to practice mercy, we need to look past that for a moment and try and look at the larger picture.
Okay, so how would we look past that in this sense?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I like to use numbers to help me do that. Listening to people's stories and testimonies is a very good way to do that. But sometimes numbers are more concrete. So I brought you guys some numbers today. About 12% of the U.S. population is made up of African Americans. So you may not be able to see the difference between the colors here, but this region here represents the blacks in the country, and everything else are non-blacks. So they're a small sliver of the population, right? This bar is the population in United States prisons. 50% of prisoners currently incarcerated in prisons across the country are African American. 1 in 3 black men in the country have spent time in prison at some point in their life. 1 in 3 black men in the country have a felony on their record. So Job's friends would look at these figures and say, if a group of people is getting so heavily punished, they're doing so much prison time, so much more prison time than other groups of people, then they must deserve it. Surely a disparity like this in how much people interact with the criminal justice system must be explained by higher crime rates in black communities. That's what we would assume when we look at this.
So that feeds back to the first thing that I hear in people's reactions. It's bad people looking for an excuse to do bad things.
Judging their behaviors.
Yeah.
Right. And we all know that poverty correlates with crime. Crime is much more likely to happen in poor communities. And it's also true that there are components of black culture that have a destructive influence on youth and can encourage bad behaviors. You know, hip-hop is not all bad, but much of it does glorify being gangsta, and it treats being a criminal as something to be proud of instead of something to be ashamed of. So all of these reasons make it very easy to jump in and take the position of a friend of Job right off the bat and say, there's nothing really wrong here because what's happening is fair. But the principle of mercy, which is what we're talking about here, calls us to look past that first brush reaction and to dig deeper before accepting that the picture like this is what it seems to be. And it turns out that this picture, hardly any of it can be explained by crime rates. Blacks are imprisoned more often and have more felonies on their records than people of other races, but it's not, in general, because they commit more crimes. To understand why, then, we have what the facts that we have to look a little more into why people are sent to prison in America. The United States puts more people in prison per capita, puts a higher percentage of our population in prison than any other country in the world. And it didn't used to be this way until the 1980s, when we as a nation, through political movements at the time, decided to become one of the most punitive countries in the world. This is a result of the war on drugs, which made possession of various kinds of drugs a federal felony. So, in this figure, you're looking at incarceration rates. So this is how many people you've been putting into prison. It starts in 1920 here and ends in 2010. In the 70s and 80s, you see a huge increase in how many people we are putting into prison. So it used to be that when somebody was labeled a felon, it tended to be because violent crime was involved. Felon convictions used to be reserved for things like murder, robbery with a deadly weapon, and rape. But when we imposed heavy penalties for drug use and selling drugs, we turned the system into something where the vast majority of prisoners and the vast majority of people today who are labeled felons have committed a non-violent crime, often of possession of drugs, sometimes of selling drugs.
Things that we used to say were minor, what we have done is we've vastly increased the population who we now perceive as dangerous. Now, I know from experience here in Southern Illinois, we see people getting put away for meth. But I have also seen multiple people where somebody had meth in their possession, but before they got to the judge, they were offered a deal. Because the police were more interested in getting the people that were supplying the meth than they were in putting away the drug user.
Which is the way we'd like to think that it works. But in fact, the vast majority of people that get locked up and that are the target of anti-drug operations that involve heavily armed police officers coming into a community and making arrests are people who have sold very small amounts of drugs or have just been caught in a routine traffic stop with a little bit on their person.
And that's what I found out was one of the differences between minority communities, whether they are black or Hispanic, and how these offenses are dealt with in white communities, is that in the minority communities, the ones who are put away for felonies, a much higher percentage of them, it's just simple possession. Whereas in white communities, the vast majority of people who do prison time, it's possession with intent to deliver. So in the minority communities, they're given a felony conviction for simply having the drug. In the majority communities, they tend to be for delivery.
So we have problem you identified with how felony still carries the connotation of somebody who's violent and dangerous. But we're taking people who have been predominantly labeled felons for possessing drugs, and now almost every employment application in most states has a checkbox saying, do you have a felony on your record? Have you ever been convicted of a criminal felony? And in housing, in applying for Section 8 low-income housing, if you have a felony on your record, you're not allowed to take government-subsidized housing. And housing complex, the apartment that I live in, it's pretty cheap because it's in kind of a rough area, but it's much better than it was a few years before I moved in because the new management came into the company and came in and decided we're going to evict 100 people, 100 families from this apartment complex because somebody in the family is harboring a criminal, or there may be a criminal staying with them, or they may have a felony on their record. And so that's 100 people that now are without home in an attempt to gentrify our neighborhood and to get the criminals out. And so the kinds of effect that this has, if 1 in 3 people in your life, 1 in 3 men, pardon me, in your life have troubles finding a job because they face legal employment discrimination based on their criminal record, have troubles finding housing, and then out of desperation turn to drugs again and cycle back into the prison system, then the effects of that on families and on your community and on a young person growing up and trying to become a person who can hold a steady job and do responsible things is devastating.
But the complaint that's being registered now is that the police respond with violence to minorities in a much higher degree. But so we have the added element now that the minorities we're talking about are minorities that cannot disappear. They cannot blend in. So whether it's Hispanics, or whether it's Asians, or whether it's blacks, just by their physical characteristics, they will always be identifiable. Now, when we were in Africa, we went through the reverse of that. Okay? We were a minority, and we could not blend in. We went to the marketplace, everybody could see us.
But it was typically a positive thing.
It was reverse discrimination because the majority of the population was used to dealing with missionaries who were honest, who were generous, who were good, and so they associated being good with this visible minority. It wasn't all of them, okay? There were some who associated political oppression and economic exploitation with being white. I had one experience where I was driving down the road as a passenger in a vehicle, and I snapped a picture out the window of a cattle herd alongside the road. Just somebody herding cattle. A guy driving the opposite direction saw me take the picture out the window. He spun around, chased us down, cut us off, forced us to stop. He was furious at me for taking the picture, because in his mind, what I was going to be doing was I was going to be taking that picture, selling it for profit in America so that Americans would think that Africans were poor. Either that, and he actually said this, I was actually taking a picture of that man so that my men could identify him later when they came back to capture him for slavery.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? And he threatened to take me to the police and accuse me of being a slaver simply because of the color of my skin. Now, that sounds radical, doesn't it? Would we ever do that here in America? The fact is, it happened last week here in Wayne County. If you read the Wayne County press, last week a teenage girl was walking along the street, and she later said that an SUV pulled up next to her, the door opened, and a man shouted at her that she had to get in the car. She didn't see him very well, and he was wearing a hoodie, but she thought he had dark hair under the hoodie, and she couldn't see his face and couldn't describe him, but she thought he might have been Hispanic. And that was what was put in the press. All of those qualifiers. Might have been, could have been. Okay. This week I get a link to a citizen journalist, someone here in Southern Illinois who thinks that the mainstream media, including the Wayne County press, don't call a spade, and they're hiding things. So she's taken it upon herself to tell the real story behind things. She asserted that white slavery is alive and well in the United States, and it's operated by Hispanic cartels who send a strong man into a community to grab women with a certain look, capture them, hide them in the immigrant farm worker population, and then ship them out of the country to be sex slaves. And she asserted that this was an example of one of these Hispanic cartels operating within southern Illinois.
And then she suggested that the police should target Hispanics to
She
search
actually
for
called the
kidnappings.
police, both here and in Lawrence County, and asked them if they had searched the immigrant farm housing in the farms in the area that hire Hispanics to find out if this girl was missing, was there. And when Megan disappeared last summer, now she tied that disappearance back to this Hispanic cartel, which is obviously operating here. And she said that anytime a teenager disappears, even for 12 hours, they ought to search the houses of every Hispanic in the neighborhood, because these cartels also use the legitimate Hispanics who are working in our restaurants and working in the land, working around our communities as spotters to identify potential targets for snatching. So she's taken this maybe, could have been, and labeled this visible minority as dangerous without a shred of evidence.
So that is an extreme example. There are very few people that would go to the point of writing an article explicitly saying we should target this minority group because they are criminals and they do horrible things. But I mean, I told you today that 1 in 3 blacks is a convicted felon. Knowing things like that inspires a sense of danger. And so when you think of law enforcement, the objection that the people protesting right now have is not that there are a few horrible police officers that do terrible racist things. What's more important is that good, well-meaning people, no different than Dad and I up here, perceive a readily identifiable minority group like blacks or Hispanics as a threat more readily. It's easier to be afraid of someone if you see an external sign that, they might be a criminal. And so studies have shown that police departments tend to target minority communities more for anti-drug operations, even if they looked at their data, they would realize that several white communities, like this happened in Seattle, there were several white communities where drug sale and possession was much more prevalent than in the black region of town. But for years, the police department had been primarily targeting the black region of town because they thought that's where the crime was, because they thought that it was easier to catch criminals in the street there. And they had several reasons, but for the most part, it's a slightly prejudiced assumption that we should be working harder to stop blacks from being criminals because they're more likely to be criminals, they're more dangerous. And yes, studies have shown in laboratories that police officers are more likely to identify a black man in a picture as a threat and click the shoot button than they are with a white. And they're faster to shoot if they think that a black person is holding a weapon in a picture. So, knowing this, when we look back at the statistics of the punishment that, in this case, society, rather than God, as with Job, the punishment that blacks suffer under, it changes the calculus. In 1999, 90% of drug arrests here in Illinois were of blacks. For every 1 white person that was arrested on a drug charge, 9 black people were. And so this leaves a crater of unemployment, devastated families, and leads people to have a temptation to go back to selling drugs, and makes the problem that does exist in the black community. I mean, we're not excusing drugs up here, but it makes the problem that does exist worse because of the way society has judged. So it's a very complex issue. Many factors are going into this. you're seeing us kind of scramble around trying to look at all sides of the issue with you here. But what I can take away from what I've learned in the last few months is it any wonder that people in black communities tend to have mistrust of the police, tend to think that law enforcement is not on their side when they know that they're being treated differently? And is it any wonder that they say with Job that right now they take to the streets to say, this isn't all our fault. This isn't just us getting our just desserts, just God meting out his righteous punishment on us.
Which brings us back to Job's friends and the whole concept of mercy. I didn't take us into this foray into current events to politicize us and to make us go out on the streets and demonstrate. I find myself, like Job's friends, jumping to judgment when I see people in trouble. And if they are using hard words, offensive words, or if they're doing bad things, then judgment is where I end up. Okay? I can always find reasons to blame them for their troubles, and if I blame them for if their troubles have a root in their own choices and behavior, then why should I help them? This comes dangerously close to our concept of the worthy poor. When we talk about helping the worthy poor, we basically are talking about this very concept of judging whether a person's suffering is a result of his behavior and therefore does not merit assistance before we will help. Now, for our family, dealing with Nick this year really took us deep into this whole issue. Nick's problems did have root in his behavior. He did things that generated problems. And while we could find contributing factors from other areas, the majority of his problems were a result of his own choices. And it became a real issue for me. But then I come back to Job's words. In trouble like this, I need loyal friends, even if I've forsaken God. That just goes, those two things of helping the worthy poor versus I need loyal friends even if I've forsaken God, they just create conflict for me. So I want to put a proposal out to us today. Okay? I want to propose that mercy is not related to judgment. Mercy is relieving suffering. That's what mercy is. Grace chooses not to prosecute. We are very good at being gracious. Someone offends us, most of the time we will still speak to them on the street. We will still be civil to them. We will still be nice to them. We will shake hands with them when we come to church, even if in our hearts we are angry at them. That's being gracious. That has nothing to do with mercy. You can be perfectly gracious to a person and have absolutely no mercy. And a corollary to that is that if we live our lives constantly judging the poor and the suffering to determine whether they are worthy of our help, Jesus states that we are outside the kingdom. Outside the kingdom. I want us to look at a couple more Bible passages before we go on here. James chapter 2, and I want us to read verses 12 through 17. So speak, and so do, as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Depart in peace, my friend, be warmed, be filled," but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works." We talk about forgiveness as being a condition of God's forgiveness. But forgiveness presupposes judgment. If I'm going to forgive you, I am saying you are guilty, but I will forgive you. I will not prosecute. That is graciousness. James takes us far beyond judgment to mercy. He asserts that mercy triumphs over judgment. And he also states that if we don't show mercy, we will receive no mercy from God. I don't know about you, but I need mercy. If I'm going to stand before a God who clearly knows everything that I have ever done and knows my heart, my mind, I need mercy. And if a convicted felon is going to live next to me in heaven, and I'm going to be safe, that mercy has to be more than just a gracious, "I'm going to let you into heaven even though you are a felon." Mercy has to be powerful. Mercy has to go beyond just forgiveness. Okay. Let's look at another passage. Okay, Matthew 25. Matthew 25 and verses 31 through 40. Vivian, if you would read these verses for us, 31 through 40.
I'm in the living. Would you rather have me in something else?
No, you can read. The living will be fine.
Okay. Matthew 25, verses 31 to 40. But when I, the Messiah, shall come in my glory, and all the angels with me, then I shall sit upon my throne of glory, and all the nations shall be gathered before me, and I will separate the people, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and place the sheep at my right hand, and the goats at my left hand. Then I, the King, shall say to those on my right, "Come, blessed of the Father, into the kingdom prepared for you from the founding of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me water. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your homes. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick and in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Sir, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you anything to drink, or a stranger and help you, or naked and clothe you? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And I, the King, will tell them, When you did it to these my brothers, you were doing it to me.
I've heard Christians take this passage and say, okay, but my brothers are only other Christians. That's what Jesus was talking. I only have to do these things for other Christians. Okay? They err because they do not know the Scriptures. Jesus was very clear with the parable of the Good Samaritan that everyone is our neighbor, everyone is our brother, and we are to show mercy to everyone. This passage struck me as I was reading this, because in this picture of the judgment, this parable of the judgment that Jesus put forward, there's no mention of beliefs. The sheep and the goat are not divided based on what those that agree with the 28 fundamentals. It didn't come into play at all. They were not divided based on their confession of Christ as Savior. In fact, those that are excluded say, we've preached in your name, we've taught in your name, we've suffered in your name, how are you going to exclude us? Okay? Our fate will depend upon our actions. And when you look at the actions that Jesus describes there, it's all about mercy. Now, there's an obvious problem here. Okay, Steve, are you really saying that what we believe is meaningless?
Salvation by works.
Excuse me, son, show some respect. Okay, I think you know me better than that. I believe that belief in God opens access to immense transformative power and resources. I can't imagine living my life without it. However, if our belief does not result in an unstoppable flood of mercy to the people around us, we've missed the boat. Christ is clear about that. The kingdom is not filled with people who believe in God. It is filled with people who have given up trying to prove how good they are. They know their need. And so Jesus' first statement in the Beatitudes is, blessed are the poor in spirit. Those are the people that will be in the kingdom. It's filled with people who have realized the burden and suffering that rebellion and sin bring upon the world. They mourn with and for God. It's filled with people who are now focused on one thing, living lives of obedience to the will of God. Not thy will, but not my will, but thy will be done, is their prayer. Only the meek will inherit the earth. It's filled with people whose greatest yearning is to be like Jesus. They hunger and thirst after his righteousness. And that righteousness is all about mercy. Micah 6:8. He hath taught thee, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of thee? But to do justly. We are called to obedience, but we are called to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. Those who hope for the kingdom tomorrow, who pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, will do these three things. They will obey, they will love mercy, and they will walk humbly with God.
But what does it mean to practice mercy?
You actually want me to be practical in church?
In Job's case, it's easier. It's cartoon, because for all we know, from what we're given, it seems like Job is pretty close to blameless.
Oh, but he was rich. And nobody gets rich without taking advantage of someone else. Okay, so, you don't let him off the hook that
So
easy.
maybe it's not that easy. Maybe it's not that easy. But it certainly is easier to say that we need to practice mercy and forgiveness and be long-suffering and non-judgmental when we're talking about somebody that doesn't really need judged in the first place. Christ called us to a radical amount of forgiveness. 70 times 7 times should you forgive your neighbor. Some people also interpret Christ's words to be calling us to practice a radically unconditional mercy, a radical non-judgment. Matthew 7:1, judge not, lest ye be judged. And Matthew 5:42 says, give to him who asks of you. Do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. So, don't discriminate between the worthy poor and the unworthy poor. So, I don't pretend to know exactly what Jesus meant in his aphorisms, or exactly how it should connect to Job and his friends, or to Ferguson, Missouri, and protests about discrimination by police. What I do know is that it sure seems like there are many cases in life where being merciful is a really bad idea. So we know that often judging people causes problems. That if you feel I've judged you unfairly and been critical of you in a way that doesn't match what you think is true about yourself, it's going to injure our relationships. In the case of the drug war, it damages the lives of millions of people. So sometimes, clearly, sometimes being merciful can help to solve the problem. Being merciful can repair the relationships. Mercy and benevolence can transform a little piece of our world from the broken morass that it is into a set of harmonious relationships that mimic the kingdom of heaven. But our experience is that that is rarely the case. People do bad things, and they hurt people. People will take advantage of our mercy. So judgment and mercy have to work together, it would seem. In a perfect universe, we would never have to judge each other. People would immediately see whenever they were hurting you, and they would stop and go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. People would immediately see that Job was blameless, and they would sit down to mourn with him, and Job wouldn't have to defend himself in the kingdom of heaven. People would already understand what he was going through. And in a perfect world, we could always take people's protests when they claim that they're being oppressed at face value, without suspecting that their point of view is skewed, or they're getting what they deserve. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to wonder or suspect that people are always making it about race when it shouldn't be. We wouldn't have to ask that question because what people said was true would be true. And we could always give to the poor in a world like the kingdom of heaven without wondering whether they would use our help responsibly. My Uncle Nick was poor, and he asked a lot from me. He sold drugs. He lied to the family repeatedly. He stole money from me. He tricked me. And he did genuinely hurtful things over and over again in the name of desperation, in the name of homelessness. And I often judged him because I know that in this world, we humans have selfish and destructive habits, and that we rarely give up these behaviors until someone speaks up and says, stop, you're hurting me. And then they pull away to protect themselves. We just read at the end of Sabbath school, we closed with James 5:19 through 20, where James says, correcting the errors of somebody else's ways and getting them to see that they are wrong about things is one of the highest virtues, because sometimes that's the only way to mend what is broken in their lives. But with Nick, I also chose mercy. Mercy in the form of listening and loving him, and mercy in the form of continuing to support him and send him money. Dad, I think a little bit ago you were talking about it in terms of relationships, of mercy as maintaining a relationship that otherwise would be broken.
Do you think that that is a thread that we might be able to use to follow in our lives?
Yeah.
Does mercy presuppose relationship in the same way that forgiveness presupposes judgment?
I think so. I think so. At least thinking in terms of my relationship with Nick, it was the times that I didn't get angry with him, or didn't tell him he was wrong, or didn't tell him, I'm not sending you any more money because you lied to me, that he knew that I was telling him that I wanted him to be in a relationship with me. When I show somebody mercy, I'm making known to them that I want to see them in the kingdom with me.
And at a relational level, it's not that we throw ourselves in and say, okay, I want you always with me. But in a relationship, there's always an element of empathy, of identifying with the other person. Whereas in judgment, we don't identify with them, we distance ourselves.
So I don't know exactly how to balance the two, because we've been really heavy on mercy in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And in talking about the race and criminal justice issues, we've implied that mercy is the correct response here, because not only is there racial injustice in the way the law is enforced, but the whole problem in the first place, including for whites that are swept up in this, is an excess of judgment. A criminal justice system that is being very punitive, and it doesn't have enough mercy to allow people the space to heal. So, I mean, the opposite of the drug war is the way we handle alcoholism. Drunk driving is very dangerous, and completely destroys lives, as much as selling drugs does and gang violence that becomes associated with it. But the minimum sentence for possession of crack is 5 years in prison. The judge cannot give you less than 5 years. They're not allowed to. The minimum sentence for your third DUI is 3 days in jail and therapy sessions. 3 days in jail, no prison. So Portugal has decided to respond to all drugs the way that we in America respond to alcohol. And they treat people who use drugs as victims. Not because they didn't do anything wrong, not because they didn't make mistakes, but because mercy is what gives you the space and support that you need to heal. Simply being punished is not always enough to lead you to reform your ways. Though judgment is a part of it. Telling people they are wrong is part of helping them heal. Both are important. And I don't know exactly how to balance them. In any given situation, it's impossible to tell. Sometimes I told Nick, I'm not sending you money again for months because you've lied to me too much, and you need to learn that you can't get away with that. Other times I told Nick, I know you lied to me last week trying to get money, but I believe you need it now, and I don't want to see you go back to prison because you can't pay your probation fees. So I would send him money, not knowing whether he used it correctly or not. Not knowing whether that decision is going to help him do better or just feed a destructive habit that was keeping him where he was, enabling him. And so Nick's story, we will never know the answer to, because he died without a happy ending. I don't know exactly how Jesus expected judgment and mercy to complement each other here on earth or in the kingdom. I think that in a perfect world like heaven, we'll still have a little bit of testy conversations, a little bit of arguments where we don't quite understand each other. But we'll be committed to mercifully working through those misunderstandings until we can resolve our differences constructively and with love. And I believe that our judgment, in order to be constructive, in order to be part of the solution to our problems with our loved ones and in society at large, that judgment has to be predicated on a commitment to mercy first. Not that you can not judge at all, but that you have to do it in a merciful spirit first. So in Matthew 7, right after the infamous "judge not" phrase, Jesus said to take the plank out of our own eye and then look to the speck in our brother's eye. I think that seeing clearly begins with looking into our brother's heart with mercy, into looking into Job and not jumping to the conclusion that Job had done something horrible, had some horrible sin that he was lying about, that God was punishing for, and asking Job truly, what is his understanding of his situation? Judgment, the kind of judgment that Christ was talking about when he said, "Judge not," is something that we use to correct other people. We use to tell other people when they're wrong. My kind of synthesis of trying to make sense of these things is that mercy is what we use to correct our judgment. By having mercy, my judgment will be constructive, will improve the relationship, and build positive relationships in the process.
I'm a little bit disappointed. Okay, I postponed the sermon partly because I knew we would have residents, but partly because I knew that the younger generation had the answers to all the questions. No, Eric, okay, it is a complex thing, and I like the synthesis that you've come to. Judgment leads to punishment, and ultimately to separation, if the other person doesn't fix themselves. Judgment makes no attempt to save the other person. It leaves the salvation up to them. Whereas mercy is focused on easing their suffering, but more than that, reclaiming the relationship. When you do wrong, harm me. Mercy is what reconciles us. If I just cling to judgment, we would never be reconciled. So, what can we say in the conclusion of the whole matter? I think Micah has something to say to us. You have taught thee, O man, what is good. What does he require of you? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. I think Job has something to say to us. In trouble like this, I need loyal friends, even when I've forsaken God. And finally, Jesus, blessed are the merciful,
For they shall obtain mercy.